Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on BRAC's ultra-poor graduation approach involving evidence, innovations and intersection with social protection. My name's Sally Ann Vincent and I'll moderate this webinar today. Bear with me please, it's the first time I've moderated a webinar on this system. I'm currently Australia's Deputy High Commissioner in Bangladesh, based in our Dhaka post, and in that role it includes the Head of Development Cooperation. I came here after being the Head of Development Cooperation in Afghanistan as well for the government, and I served with AusAid since 2007 and now with DFAT. It's a pleasure to be here. As you all know, the governments of developing and middle income countries have an increased focus on creating sustainable employment through social protection programs. Many governments are still struggling with this issue and many successful models have been evolved in different parts of the world. In this webinar, BRAC, the world's largest NGO, will unpack its ultra-poor graduation approach, its effectiveness in lifting the extremely poor people above the poverty line, and various international adaptations. There's a growing body of evidence of positive impact of these programs, and the BRAC model offers tremendous potential for integrating the approach to social protection programming. I know this because we've been working here with BRAC for a number of years, the Australian government. We have a strategic partnership with BRAC and the United Kingdom that's in its second phase and worth $93 million till 2020. Just last week I was out visiting communities in Jessore and Kulna looking at both the ultra-poor program and the graduation models. There's some really exciting and really energetic work going on that's making a real difference here. I'm very excited to be moderating this webinar. This webinar has been organised by an online community of practice called Social Protection for Employment, and it's supported by the Australian Government through DFAT and GIZ's Global Alliance for Social Protection. Social Protection for Employment Community aims to facilitate South-South knowledge exchange on how to link social protection to employment creation to fill in the knowledge gap in this field. This is the second in a series of webinars organised by the Social Protection for Employment Community. The last one was held on Philippines Sustainable Livelihood Program in November last year. Like I said, I'm very excited to be here, certainly as well as with BRAC, and very excited to be introducing the presenter and the discussant, who are both well-renowned leaders in these fields. First, let me introduce Sadhna Samaranayake, who, I've probably mangled your name, I apologise, Sadhna, who's the Senior Advisor for the BRAC Ultra-Poor Advocacy and Advisory Services. Now you can see on your screen Sadhna's extensive experience. He advises BRAC's consulting services and technical assistance to external governments and INGOs relating to BRAC's ultra-poor graduation approach. Currently Sadhna is leading a number of teams in this area and the delivery of graduation approaches for many governments around the world and INGOs. Her work has spanned a variety of development sectors and she's worked extensively in a number of countries including Bangladesh. I'd also like to introduce the discussant, Dr. Michael Sampson. Michael Sampson is the Director of Research of the Economic Policy Research Institute. He has 25 years experience working in social protection and specialises in designing, implementing, monitoring and evaluating social cash transfer programs. You can see his vast experience in many countries and the work he's undergoing at the moment, and he also lectures at policy conferences and training workshops around the world and is a visiting Associate Professor of Economics at Williams College Centre for Development Economics in the US. So we've got it's a pleasure to meet you, Michael. Look forward to both of your discussions, and I'd like to start now by jumping straight into it, and I'd like to invite Sadhna to present. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss BRAC's Targeting the Ultra-Poor program. Its full form is Challenging the Frontiers of Poverty Reduction, Targeting the Ultra-Poor. But happily it's become to be known globally as the Ultra-Poor Graduation Approach, something that's a little easier to remember. If we could have the next slide, please. Today I want to really just divide my slides into sort of three major areas to focus on. So first of all, we're going to look at unpacking what it is that we mean when we say the graduation approach. What is it? What is it not? And what do we mean when we say that a household has quote-unquote graduated? We're also going to then look very briefly at the evidence, the external evaluations around this approach, at least for BRAC. And then Dr. Michael Sampson will be picking up in a little bit more depth and detail about the evidence base. And then finally we're going to talk about some of the bigger questions around innovation, adaptation, and scale, and some of the key considerations that underpin those questions, such as those of complexity and cost. So let's get right to it. If we could have the next slide. First, just a really quick background on BRAC. So BRAC is the world's largest development organization. We have staff north of 120,000, serving 138 million clients worldwide in 11 countries. We were founded in Bangladesh in 1972 as a limited relief and rehabilitation initiative, and have really scaled from there to a point where our operating budget is actually comprised in considerable scope by our social enterprises, the largest of which is our microfinance operation, which is scaled nationally in Bangladesh as well as other countries where we operate, and you'll see the list right at the bottom there of other countries where we work, spanning Asia, West and East Africa. The next slide, please. A real quick background of the genesis of the graduation approach, if we could just sort of think about the history of BRAC, where we were. I would say it was probably in the mid to late 80s on through the early 90s, with scaled up programming at that point in microfinance and health and education and other areas, that our frontline workers began to realize that despite quite scaled up programming in all of these areas, that we were actually failing to reach the most destitute in the communities where we worked. And as a development sector organization with a very clear pro-poor mandate, this was something that we had to look quite critically at. So if you look at it from the perspective of, let's say, a microfinance field worker, they understood that there was a certain subsegment of the population, sort of hidden families and communities, that would never be eligible for microfinance loan in the sense of sort of social collateral and working with peer households to apply for a loan, because these individuals were so stigmatized, so ostracized, and so at the margins of their own communities that they would not be considered sort of worthy of their peers to be part of a group. And they weren't showing up in our targeting for our other programs either, our health, education, and other programs, largely because of a sense of social stigma and potentially a lack of food security that was inhibiting them, and chronic poor health that was inhibiting them from even showing up in the targeting exercises for these other programs. And that really caused us through what kind of intervention could we align to these most destitute households and populations. And the Targeting the Ultra-Poor program, which was actually formalized in 2002 in its current form, actually had about sort of 10 years of research and innovation and trial and error before that, and a predecessor program that started much before. But as it's known now, Targeting the Ultra-Poor has in Bangladesh alone graduated about 1.7 million households. That's households comprised of roughly about 6.8 million individuals, we think. And we've also run pilots in countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Sudan, and are now expanding to Uganda and Tanzania. Next slide, please. So it's important for us to unpack a little bit here what we mean when we say the ultra-poor. So as you know, the World Bank has set the ultra-poor or the extreme poor line at $1.90 a day. And the reason that we talk about ultra-poor in some sense as opposed to extreme poor is because we feel that there is merit to identifying that there are certain segmentation even underneath that line, right? So you have certain qualitative characteristics that are associated with the most destitute that you'll see here below. So these are individuals that are chronically food insecure. They're disconnected from mainstream government services. In fact, part of our targeting in Bangladesh is that if you, are on a social transfer program, you're likely not eligible for the graduation approach. These are individuals that are absolutely the most vulnerable to health shocks and natural disasters. They often live in geographically isolated areas. They're underserved by markets. Trickle-down economics definitely does not reach these households. They lack community acceptance, and disproportionately, we find that these households are female-headed. The next slide, please. So given the audience today at socialprotection.org, we thought it important to really sort of try to unpack where we think graduation approaches sit in the social protection landscape. And we actually think that graduation approaches sit at the nexus of three different things. So on the one hand, social protection and possibly the more promotive aspects of social protection. And then also we feel that it sits at the intersection of that and livelihoods programming, traditional livelihoods programming that tries to put households on a path towards sustainable livelihoods through skill building and capital injection. But we also feel that there's a strong financial inclusion element of the work. So we think that it kind of sits at the nexus of those three things and that it's a strong complement to social protection. So if you look at this illustration here, this is a bit of how we think about it. So here in this illustration, you'll see a family that's sitting on a net. And you can think about that as a safety net program, or you can think about that as a social protection floor. But we also believe that individuals on these safety nets and on a social protection floor, that there are subsegments and populations that, given the right combination of things, have latent economic potential that can be tapped, that can put them on a pathway to sustainable livelihoods and development and greater resilience. And we feel that the graduation approach is one of those combinations of things. So if we could have the next slide. Now that we've sort of tried to orient where we are in the social protection landscape, this is a really quick illustration that shows you exactly what we mean when we say graduation and what the components are. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screen there's a timeline there going from 0 to 24 months. BRAC graduation programming uniformly runs about 24 months, and it starts with a microscope on the community in terms of finding, targeting, as our name would suggest, the poorest and the most destitute. And then over a period of 24 months, we look at a combination of sequenced interventions that are all sort of working together to try to boost the resilience of this community, of this household, and address the multifaceted dimensions of poverty that they face. So there are certain components that run all the way through, and we'll go through some of these. But then there are things that sort of happen at a particular point early on in the program, like, for instance, a high-value asset is transferred into the household, or cash, capital injection, or a loan in order to procure a high-value asset. At the same time, a consumption stipend, which is given to the household to sort of buy a little bit of breathing room, which tends to taper off at the point where that initial asset starts to deliver a return to the household. We also have a savings component that starts roughly around the same time, and the entire way through there are elements of healthcare, social integration, and hands-on coaching, all working together towards these outcomes that you see here on the right of your screen. So we're looking for increased assets, food security, savings and financial inclusion, better health, increased social capital, and productive skill sets. So really we're looking for outcomes that speak to resilience in this household. So that's what we mean when we say graduation. And I think it's also important here to underscore a little bit what we do not mean when we talk about graduation, because there often is some confusion about that. I think maybe because of the moniker of graduation and what that signifies to people. So when we say graduation, we're not talking about an exit event. We're not talking about individuals exiting a social protection program or going from a school feeding program to another program. It's not an event. It's a sequenced combination of programmatic interventions that lead to resiliency outcomes. We also do the only way to address the needs of the ultra-poor or the most destitute, but it does seem to be a way that has now a good basis of research and evidence behind it. And we do understand from several different country contexts and through several different types of implementers, thanks to pilots run by Ford and the Ford Foundation and CGAP, that this is a combination of interventions that does work. And we also look at graduation really as a complement to social protection programming. If we can have the next slide. So the next few slides I'm going to take you really quickly through a little bit of a visual of what some of these steps look like, at least in Bangladesh. So here what you're looking at is that first and essential step of targeting. Now, targeting happens differently in different country contexts. In some cases there are strong and robust databases to rely on. In some cases it's more of working with the communities. But in BRAC we always look at a little bit of a multi-pronged approach. We first rely on sort of indications and poverty maps to understand where there is the greatest poverty density when we decide where to put down our programming. And then we work with the community in a participatory wealth ranking, and that's the picture that you see here. And what happens is we call community members together at a certain place and time, and our facilitators walk through the process of physically mapping out the community. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that within a community that no one is left behind, even if someone is on the margins of people's awareness, and if they're so ostracized that maybe they don't have the social capital to show up to the physical targeting or even be talked about by people who do show up. The actual mapping exercise ensures, and the children in particular who are present at this exercise often ensure that we remember that so-and-so lives behind so-and-so's homestead, and let's make sure they're also reflected on this community map. And then our facilitators run through a process of walking the community through different levels of relative well-being. Now, it is a fairly uniformly poor community, but even within a poor community there are levels of resilience and relative levels of well-being. For instance, you might have, excuse me, a household that has a remittance coming to them from abroad or from someone in Dhaka. You might have, a secondary breadwinner, and you might have other indications of vulnerability that make someone's situation very precarious. So the community is walked through this exercise of community organizing and understanding that there are different levels of well-being, and the community self-organizes themselves into 5, 6, 7 different categories. And what BRAC does is we take the information surfaced in those bottom categories and we then do a house-to-house survey to verify the information surfaced from the community. And that's how we come to our final list of participants. And if we can have the next slide, what you'll take a look at here is that next step of transferring an asset to the household. So here you see a woman who's about to receive one asset package that we offer in rural Bangladesh, which is a cow and a goat. Oftentimes graduation programming in rural areas, there are several asset packages that revolve around multiple combinations of livestock. There are also cash crop related packages. There's usually also a bundle of goods to start a small petty trade operation. In urban areas, there's a lot of asset packages that have to do with equipping people to do door-to-door sales of fruit or cooked foods, clothes, things like that. So different enterprises, depending on the context and how we come to these enterprises, has to be underpinned through a fairly rigorous market assessment. Some graduation programs, ours included, don't stop at just transferring assets. We also, to some populations, transfer cash, and we also transfer, in the case of BRAC's programming, soft loans from our microfinance operation where we actually expect repayment of that capital. If you can have the next slide, there's also this element that we call the consumption stipend. And the consumption stipend really is about providing a little bit of breathing room. And we find that for the most destitute households, it's very difficult for them to even think about sort of operationalizing this new asset that they have into their household when they're sort of caught in the day-to-day activities of day labor or begging in some cases. And so in order to sort of simply meet consumption needs, they need a little bit of a drip coming into their household, and so that consumption stipend is what offsets some of their time and provides them some breathing room to engage in this program and engage with this new asset, and that tends to taper off somewhere between 6 to 9 months in most graduation programs. And on the next slide, if we could have the next slide, we'll just take a quick look at the savings component, which actually is really different in different country contexts. In Bangladesh, we have a huge microfinance footprint, and we have our own microfinance operations. So for us to work with clients in terms of inculcating a savings discipline, what we do is we incorporate financial literacy messaging, and we also open up savings accounts in our microfinance operation. But in other countries where we work, where there is a limited microfinance footprint or where we advise, we're really looking to tap into the local indigenous savings practice, whatever that may be. So self-help groups, village savings loans associations, table banking, whatever the local construct is around saving, we look to sort of provide messaging and create a practice around that in this program. On the next slide, you'll get a look at, I think it's the technical skills training piece of what we do. So if you remember, we've got about 5 to 8 different enterprise options in any given location where a graduation program is run. And aligned specifically to those enterprises are training modules. So 3 to 5 days of training that, for instance, if your asset package was around a bundle of goods to start a petty trade operation, your technical training would be around how do you manage that inventory and how do you know sort of what's moving quickly, when do you replenish stock, when do you start investing in different types of stock, how do you deal with people who might want to buy things from you on credit. So it's quite tailored content to that household. It's delivered usually pictorially, and there's a lot of reinforcement. There's a refresher session around that. And on the next slide, you can see through this component that we call life skills coaching. It's also called hands-on coaching or mentoring in some cases. This is a slightly different intervention, which we actually feel potentially is really the secret ingredient in this model. We have frontline workers coming to the participant's home or homestead on a regular basis, so weekly, bi-weekly, and part of what they're doing is they're reinforcing that technical training related to that enterprise. But there are many different functions of what this frontline worker is doing. So in addition to the reinforcement of the technical training, they're also troubleshooting. So they're also helping this person determine, you know, what's going wrong. My stock isn't selling. My asset looks like it's fallen sick. So there's a little bit of sort of troubleshooting around that. There's also this element of coaching and guidance that's provided by this mentor. And for a lot of ultra-poor clients who have really been completely ostracized and on the margins of society, this kind of interaction is the first time that they've had someone showing up in their household, inquiring on a regular basis, really invested in their development and their growth. And we feel that this particular part of the intervention does something that most development programs maybe don't focus on or emphasize as much, where you'll often see approaches that transfer capital or skills into a household addressing, you know, a poverty of skills and a poverty of cash. This is really trying to address a poverty of hope and a poverty of vision. So if you really think about it, any one of us, as we make strides in our lives and our careers, need to be able to believe that it's possible, need to be able to see a future. And a lot of these households don't have a time horizon past perhaps the next day, because that's really focusing on the next meal is the next priority. Counseling, guidance, and providing hope. On the next slide, you'll see another part of the intervention which we feel is quite critical to graduation outcomes, and that's providing health care. So if you notice, all of these interventions are really about trying to address the different vulnerabilities that these households face in terms of savings, in terms of assets, the sort of barriers that they face to getting a steady foothold on that pathway out of poverty. And we look at a health event, a serious health event, or potentially not even a very serious one at the household level. If a child falls sick or a breadwinner falls sick, this is a serious erosion of their progress and a serious setback in their progress out of poverty. So part of our intervention also aligns our community health workers and promoters and makes available panel doctors to households in the Targeting the Ultra-Poor program. And on the final slide here, you'll take a look at what we call social integration, another sort of community organizing component of what we do. We mobilize the community and village elders and respected to sit on a monthly basis in a committee, which they volunteer to do, to really sort of hear and understand and see and give agency to these ultra-poor households and women for the first time. And the kinds of issues that they raise at these meetings could be anything from, you know, I'm having difficulty getting a birth certificate arranged for, you know, a new child in the household, or it could be that, you know, my neighbor is causing problems for me. But this is really the first time that a lot of these women feel that they have a right to address and speak about and give voice to their problems, and is a huge part of building that social capital and reintegrating or integrating them for the first time in the social fabric of their communities. The next slide, please. So what do we mean when we say that a household is graduated? So we don't look at it as crossing, you know, a threshold of $1.90 a day. These are very poor populations, and we understand that there will be shocks to the household, and we understand that it is possible for them to fall back below, you know, a threshold value of income. But what we're actually looking for are multiple graduation criteria that together speak to resilience. So we're looking at criteria in food security. So graduating clients in our program must have access to at least 2 nutritious meals a day. We're looking at multiple indicators that speak to economic resilience, so multiplicity of income. We are sure that asset value will increase because we are, after all, transferring assets into households, but we want to make sure that that value has doubled by the end of the 2-year intervention, that there's improvement in the home condition in Bangladesh, usually measured by the presence of a tin roof or a more permanent housing structure. We want to make sure that there's practice of wash, and that there are indicators that speak to social inclusion and empowerment. So for instance, the household is the woman is involved in making household decisions and participating in local governance structures or other local events. And then we're looking for positive behavior change around potentially harmful social norms, like taking your children out of school early or engaging in early childhood marriage. So when we say that a household is graduated in Bangladesh, we're really looking for them to have met all of these criteria. Of course, the bottom ones here below, positive behavior change, only apply if you have school-going age children, and they only apply if you have you know, young people that might otherwise engage in underage marriage. But for the criteria that do apply, we look at all of them applying to consider you having graduated. And on the next slide here, you'll see some of our results. So we actually look at around 95% graduation rates across Bangladesh, and happily a lot of those results sustain 7 years on. We'll talk about that in a second. But briefly to also mention that in 2006, the Ford Foundation and CGAP, interested in the story of the graduation approach, undertook 10 pilots in 8 countries, essentially to test whether the BRAC model could be implemented outside of BRAC and outside of Bangladesh. So it was implemented through large and small NGOs, through microfinance initiatives, through government agencies, and happily the RCTs behind that as well seem to show very positive results on the same dimensions. So on the next slide, we'll actually start to look through, on the next slide again, our evidence around the graduation approach. So briefly, BRAC has to date conducted the largest RCT and the longest, the longitudinal study around the approach, so involving around 21,000 households. And just to briefly capture this, 7 years after intervention. So we're looking at data that was gathered at the 2-year mark, so right as the program concluded, at the 4-year mark, which is 2 years after the intervention, and at the 7-year mark, which is 5 years after the intervention concluded. And these are the results that you see after 7 years. So we're looking at a 37% increase in annual income for these households, a dramatic increase in hours devoted to productive and stable work as opposed to volatile work or potentially begging, a 10% increase in consumption expenditures, a 9x increase in savings, and twice the access to owned and leased land. So we look at these as very positive outcomes. If we could have the next slide. And I know that Dr. Sampson will talk about this a little bit as well, but the key point for us to underscore here is that we understand now, based on longitudinal data, that the approach really builds resilience and enables faster recovery from shocks and an ability to bounce back. That's what the long-term data seems to tell us, because 7 years later, the ultra-poor seem to be continuing to escape poverty at a steady rate. On the next slide, I want to take a little bit of a deep dive into one of the dimensions of the research. So this is around the impact on nutrition in children. So here, the thesis and what we're interested in looking at is what causes intergenerational transference of poverty in destitute households. And the thesis really is that if you have poor maternal health and reproductive health, and you couple that in with child malnutrition, then that's really a recipe for intergenerational transference of poverty. And without sort of breaking that dynamic, this sort of goal of attaining an elimination of extreme poverty becomes out of reach. So on the next slide, you'll see a little bit of the detailed outcomes of this analysis. So again, looking at around 27,000 households in Bangladesh, we find that over a period of long-term analysis, that in the children under 5 category, that you have a reduction of wasting by 8% and a likelihood of being underweight by 19%. In older children, 6 to 19, a reduction in thinness by 4% and a reduction in likelihood of being underweight by 10%. Largely to do with the messaging that's passed forward in those home visits around sort of, practices of breastfeeding and the like, and an increase apparently in the duration of exclusive breastfeeding by 73 days, which is 75% over baseline, and also spillover effects into the rest of the community by about 49% over baseline. The probability of children receiving vitamin A supplements increases by about 26%, and we see overall greater food security measured by 2 meals a day goes up by around 14% for the ultra-poor and 6% for the non-poor through some spillover effects as well. On the next slide, we now will move into some of the sort of bigger questions, I think, about graduation that have to do with innovation, adaptation, and scale. So if we take a look at the map on the next slide here, you'll get a little bit of a sense of exactly how graduation has expanded and over what timeline. So that initial red dot there is us in Bangladesh. And then the yellow dots around that are those forward and CGAP pilots that I mentioned that are pulling in RCT data that largely is parallel to what we're seeing. Then, since 2010, we've seen a proliferation of NGOs who are implementing the approach, and those are the green dots that you see, and as well as some donor-implemented approaches, particularly by UNHCR for refugee communities. And then finally, in light blue, since 2013, we're seeing a lot of government interest in the approach and a lot of nesting in and integration of the approach in government social protection programs. So we actually see, a great amount of momentum around graduation approaches, which is why we wanted to unpack a little bit of where we think the movement is going in terms of innovation and in terms of adaptation. But before we do that, there are a few salient questions that have to be addressed first, right? So you can't discuss innovation and you can't address adaptation and the potential for scale without addressing questions about cost of this model and complexity. So on the next slide, we start to break that down a little bit. So what really drives the cost and complexity of the model? So we often hear that this is a really difficult program to implement, or it's expensive to do so, and there's some validity to that. So let's unpack that a little more. So what makes this complex and costly? So for one thing, it's not a program that does one thing, right? It's not transferring cash into a household and stopping at that. There's savings, there's consumption stipends, there's assets, there's coaching, there's training. So all of those things together, including the fact that the asset transfer itself is a fairly large ticket item, does make it seem a costly intervention. But there's also another component that lends to some of the cost in areas where labor is potentially not as inexpensive as it is in parts of South Asia. And that's this interaction that you see here in front of you, which is the weekly visit. So that frontline worker that we suspect is really part of what's driving these outcomes is engaging with this participant in a very deep and meaningful way, and they're asking questions like, well, how is your cash flow and how are your livestock and assets doing? But they're also weighing in with encouragement and saying things like, you've really made great progress, and let's walk through your savings plan. They're checking in about how things are going on at the home, and they're addressing questions like, my neighbor is maybe creating problems for me. So that really involves a level of training of your frontline staff and equipping them with some soft skills and some hard skills to be able to engage and support someone over a 2-year term, which is a profile that may be different from a typical frontline worker. So on the next slide, you'll have a look at how some of this cost breaks down in Bangladesh. And this is data that's just a little bit over a year old, but generally speaking, we see around a cost of around $500 to $550. And in Bangladesh, the asset transfer does form a good chunk of that cost. We have the technical and skill training, which you can think about as the staff cost, and the stipend. So this is sort of an approximate breakdown. But the cost in Bangladesh and West Bengal in general are some of the cheaper costs that we've seen. And the costs, the actual cost of implementing this program really do vary widely depending on context, organizational infrastructure, terrain, population density. If you have a lot of people in a small area, it's often easier to service them rather than in context like Haiti's Central Plateau, for instance, where that cost goes up from about $500 per household for the 2 years to roughly around $2,000 over the 2 years. So that will give you a sense of the variation in cost. On the next slide, we wanted to sort of run you through some ideas and some thinking around how potentially some of these arguments are a little bit simplified. So when we talk about cost in graduation approaches, we have this high value cost like $2,000, but we also need to recognize that that's the cost per household, not per individual. So that even though the intervention is largely through one individual, we consider the household having graduated when all members of the household are food secure, when all members of the household are benefiting from multiple sources of income. So it's not a per person cost, but a per household cost. And secondly, it's the all-in total cost over 2 years, whereas other programs, including social protection and livelihood programming, might work in perpetuity. There is a time-bound nature of the graduation approach, and there's been some analysis done about cost-benefit calculations. So the London School of Economics, which conducted the RCT that I referenced earlier about graduation longitudinal outcomes, has done some work around looking at the dollar invested and what that brings in terms of returns over the productive lifespan of a client. And we understand that return is about $5.4 to every $1 invested. So in those terms, we think that this is a strong value for money approach. And the other thing to think about is that for NGOs and social protection agencies in particular, who already have strong programming in areas like livelihoods and financial inclusion and cash transfers, that this is not actually programming to be invented. In many cases, it's programming that needs to be integrated and sort of recombined and reimagined, and that these actually are potentially marginal costs and trade-offs for these organizations for potentially much stronger impacts. And the next slide, please. So starting to wrap up here, we wanted to kind of run you through what we at BRAC are moving into in terms of our next chapter in graduation. So BRAC is first and foremost a development organization that focuses on implementation. So for us, a lot of the next 3, 5, 10 years is about direct implementation of graduation approaches in Asia and Africa, and looking at some of these innovations that I'm going to unpack in a second here. But apart from the direct implementation, we also are investing in advocacy and knowledge dissemination around the graduation approach. So how do we elevate this as an approach that has an evidence basis behind it, that can contribute to achieving SDG 1, the goal of ending extreme poverty everywhere? How can we transmit tools, training materials, and information to organizations that want to learn how to do this work, and we have a team across the BRAC global family of entities focusing on just that. And we also provide technical and advisory services to various INGOs, microfinance institutions, and governments around the world on precisely how to do that. So we're looking at program design work, workshops, actually providing technical advisory and guidance over the course of pilot implementations, training materials, and the like. So that's our next chapter. Where do we see the field going broadly? Well, we see that there's actually going to be, over the next 5 years, quite a bit of testing and adaptation and innovation around some of those questions that I outlined earlier about how do you really think about reducing cost and complexity, because we understand that for meaningful scale and integration, particularly with social protection programs and government programs, we need to really figure out what is the right return on investment and what's the best way to stretch multilateral and government budgets to reach poor communities. So a lot of the innovations that we foresee are around testing the efficacy of providing assets as physical assets or cash, for instance. So we see certain pilots gearing up to do just that, including some of our own. We're looking at pilots that vary the frequency and the complexity of the home visit in various ways. We're looking at certain pilots that engage in group coaching for certain aspects of the intervention. So part of what may have been delivered individually between a frontline worker and a participant now is elevated into a bit more of a group platform. We're also seeing some programs, particularly in East Africa and among pastoralist communities. One of the clients that we work with, BOMA, working in group interventions, and that's a really interesting model because, you know, with pastoralist communities where the men in the household may be out with the herd and grazing for extensive periods of time, the women seem to band together and have limited enterprise options that really require the presence of other women to be able to, for instance, run you know, a petty trade operation and keep it open. You need to sort of work with your peers in order to do that. And so we see group transfers working well in these contexts. And we're also seeing innovation along the lines of applying technology again, to the high-cost activities of graduation programming, including the home visits. So is it possible to use tablets and messaging that comes through technology to help sort of reduce the time and cost and complexity of the home visit? Certainly, the use of technology in management information systems and monitoring systems, and the use of mobile delivery of cash for consumption stipends and for asset transfers. And on the next slide, sort of another dimension of the innovation is about populations for which graduation is being tested. So it's not uniformly just ultra-poor communities that this approach can work with, but communities that have a high incidence of vulnerability. So we see a lot of adaptations of the graduation program working with refugee communities. UNHCR and another peer organization, Trickle Up, is doing fantastic work in this arena. Also programming working with differently abled populations, climate change affected populations, and conflict affected. And another key area of programming, which are youth populations in countries like Uganda with a huge youth bulge, sort of thinking through what's the right way to conceptualize graduation programming in a way that provides a jump start for youth that's different from an older participant. For instance, thinking about, rather than a physical asset transfer, can we transfer vocational training or experiences, apprenticeships that help put them on the pathway towards integration into labor markets. And another key area of innovation that we think is really important in the question of scale is working with social protection agencies who we believe are really some of the most promising agents of scale to take this work forward. You know, for instance, right now we're in Manila, we're working with the Department of Social Welfare and Development in Manila that runs, you know, a very scaled up CCT and sustainable livelihoods programming and a community-driven development approach, really looking at launching a pilot that integrates programming aspects and elements from these three independent pillars of programming in a convergence exercise. So that's where we think that the real innovation of this model is in terms of nesting into social protection agencies for greater impact and scale. Of course, there's also the need to understand better and innovate around interministerial coordination of delivery arrangements for these approaches. It's not feasible to think that across the globe there will be agencies that can do it themselves. They will need to be collaboration and coordination between agencies. And there are also consortium approaches that we see coming together where government social protection agencies are working closely with small and large NGOs and other stakeholders, potentially even private sector stakeholders, to start delivering some of these graduation components. So with that, on the final slide here, I'd just like to leave you with a little bit of an illustration on graduation's big push. So the real theory of change behind graduation programming, as we see it, is that if we're really serious about ending extreme poverty globally by 2030, according to sustainable goals and the World Bank mandate, we really can't do that until and unless we really start to think about destitute populations whose conditions have not changed for generations and are likely not to change for generations unless and until there is a comprehensive, tailored and multifaceted approach that really is directed to the multiple dimensions of vulnerability that they face. And so you'll see some of these here: limited assets, food scarcity, lack of savings, the lack of quality health care, the lack of productive skills, and the lack of social integration. And we feel that a real pathway out of poverty that's sustainable, that's time-bound for these households, requires a combined and sequenced approach. And graduation is, we believe, one such approach with strong data behind it now. And on the next slide, if you'd like to learn more about the approach, we welcome you to visit us at ultrapoorgraduation.com or contact us at this email address, and we'd be happy to share with you materials, manuals, and other resources if you're interested in the approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sadhna, for that really interesting presentation, which I think demonstrated really well BRAC's dedication to adaptation and constant review. I'd like to invite Dr. Sampson now as the discussant to further discuss the presentation and BRAC's approach for targeting the ultra-poor and the graduation model. Thank you, Sadhna.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sadhna, for an excellent and very illuminating presentation. And thank you, Sally-Ann, and all of you who are on this webinar for the opportunity to share some of the evidence that EPRI has worked on with BRAC over the past 5 or 6 years. I want to ask 2 questions. Looking at the model that Sadhna's just presented, does this really work? And perhaps more importantly, why? And then I want to reflect from a social protection perspective on what it can mean for people interested in social protection. The next slide gives us a little bit of background on the policy context for social protection. What we see is that this approach can not only deliver developmental and livelihoods impacts, it can help address the key goals of social protection programs. And we've seen these programs scale up all around the world, tenfold in Africa over the past decade and a half, and growing even more rapidly in Asia. And as policymakers invest in social protection, their expectations are elevated, and they want to see not only progress in tackling poverty and vulnerability, but longer-term developmental impacts, the kinds of developmental impacts we see from this program. But perhaps more importantly, what Sadhna identified here is the role of complexity. This program and the best social protection systems will build more integrated and comprehensive approaches. And these can help strengthen a range of impacts across vital policy sectors. The next slide identifies 4 ways we hear policymakers talking about graduation. Most simply, it's exogenous exit. In a public works program, a policymaker wants participants to graduate out of the program in 6 months or maybe a year, or in some of the best programs, 18 months. But as we see, for example, in South Africa, the poor households are graduating from public works programs right back into poverty. Now, that's exogenous exit in that it is set based on a predetermined time frame for exit from the program. Endogenous exit is a little bit trickier and wrapped up in all the challenges we face with targeting. Do we graduate a household? Does a household exit a social protection program when it reaches a certain threshold where it's deemed to no longer need this program? And the problem with this endogenous exit, this retargeting process, is it can create a whole range of perverse incentives that encourage households to remain poor. Now, a lot of people look at this program, BRAC's program, and they see it as a graduation into sustainable livelihoods, that by combining these interventions, you enable a household with the right inputs, the right training, the right services, the right stipends and social protection support to be able to graduate into more sustaining livelihoods. But I think the second important thing Sada identified here is actually more complex than that. It's about a process, and this is what we define as the 4th kind of graduation, a developmental graduation, not crossing a threshold, but being lifted onto a path of dynamic deepening of developmental impact. What we see is that the results of the program increase over time even after the program has ended. Now, the next slide here illustrates some of this data from a study that we conducted about 5 years ago at the invitation of what was AusAid at the time, DFAT now, and DFID. We spent a few weeks working in the field with BRAC, visiting households who were participating in this program, and looking at the management information systems at village level. And then in DACA, looking at the data in their MIS and the monitoring of a range of developmental outcomes. This was a little bit before the term graduation was being widely applied to this program. And this slide here illustrates 3 panels, and I'll start with that 2007 cohort. In December 2008, at the end of the initial intervention, we saw that 74% of these households had achieved the combination of outcomes, the multidimensional basket of indicators that BRAC identified as success from the program. And then a year later, a year after the program had ended, that same group, 82% of them had achieved this combination of impacts. And then a further year later, or actually 6 months later, in June 2010, 93% had achieved this impact. This illustrates the sustainability of the program's impacts. In fact, more than sustainability, the fact that they were growing over time. This is the resilience and the deepening of developmental impact. Now, for the 2008 cohort at the time, we only had 2 years of data, but we saw a similar trend over those 2 years analyzing the monitoring data. And then for the 3rd cohort, we only had the graduation data at end of program. But the second thing we saw, which we thought very important, was that the long-term trend across cohorts was increasing. And what we just heard from Sadna is that the most recent data, more than 95% of current graduates at the end of the program have achieved these results. What this suggests is an ongoing process of learning by doing, and management responsiveness, improving the delivery of the program over time. Now, this is monitoring data. It's not an impact assessment. But I want to turn to the next slide that goes back to some of the results that Sadna talked about a few minutes ago. Now, the first 4 years of this study were a randomized controlled trial with a control group and a treatment group. The 5th, 6th, and 7th years, so what we see at the 7th year, that control group had been incorporated into the program. It's a technique that we use to address some of the ethical issues of randomized controlled trials. So the 7-year data is not comparison against a control group, but against the wealthier groups within the study. Now, the study did 2 important things and identified one very important factor that I think drives the success of this program, that it's not so much improving the employment prospects of the participants, but enabling them to change the kinds of occupations from which they can generate their livelihoods. What we see in Bangladesh, and we see in many other countries at Bangladesh's socioeconomic income level, is that wage employment can be impoverishing. In fact, one of the reasons we see, compared to social protection programs, a relatively small increase in money-measured well-being is because measures of money well-being in Bangladesh and in Malawi and in Mozambique and in a number of other countries where we've studied can actually be negatively related to being able to break out of poverty over the long term. And what BRAC has done is twofold. It's identified that getting into a self-employment livelihood is better able to break these chains of poverty, and measuring multidimensional measures of well-being is more important than just focusing on the money. And so the results we see here is a decrease in the low-paying volatile wage employment by 170 hours. That's a 26% reduction compared to 4 years prior for the treatment group compared to the control group, but an increase in self-employment hours by more than double that, by 388 hours. That's 25% more days worked, and that's a 92% increase relative to the baseline. Now that translates to a 37% increase in earnings and an increase in per capita household expenditure by 8%. But those are just the money measured indicators. Across a range of other developmental indicators, much more significant impact, not least of which, and I'll come back to this in a minute, a 9-fold increase in savings. Now, the next slide illustrates how some of these indicators looked 3 years after that, at the 7-year mark. We saw a small increase, and these numbers that we're looking at are the ratios of the wealthy groups within the study to the ultra-poor participating in the program. And so that ratio will range anywhere from 2-to-1 to 10-to-1 as we compare different indicators for these two groups. In every case, we see an improvement in these ratios at the 7-year mark for participants in the program. That is an equalizing effect, an increase in durable expenditures, although a small one. And there's an interesting reason behind that. I won't go into details now, but I'll be happy to answer questions about that. More importantly, a 43% reduction in non-durable expenditures. We heard a few minutes ago about how important the undernutrition problem is in Bangladesh. And the food inputs that go into improving these nutritional outcomes are in that non-durable expenditure bucket. The next slide takes a look at savings, and this has been a highlight of many of the development partners and international organizations and policymakers who have looked at this model. We see that with participation in the program, there's a 90%, a stunning 90% reduction in the savings gap. Participants in the program are saving on par with the wealthiest groups within the country in terms of the measured savings rate, not the total amount of savings. And this financial inclusion element is woven into the way the program is designed and implemented, and has been highlighted as a major ingredient in the success of the adaptations of this program around the world. Now, the next slide goes further in terms of these impacts. We see a 93% reduction in the livestock value gap. Now, that's in no small part because livestock is the most preferred asset of choice. Households in the program have a choice of 5 or 6 different kinds of livelihoods activities, but choosing a cow and that livestock is the preferred choice of over 90%, at least of the participants in the sample that we studied. And I think that also highlights an important element that Sadna pointed out earlier, the importance of psychosocial impacts. Because when we look at the kinds of impacts we see in these households, we can't explain all of this impact just based on the economics of the asset. But these assets are also conveying status within communities. They're reinforcing dignity. They're strengthening the psychosocial resources that we call hope, self-esteem, and dignity. And these are vital assets in improving well-being and sustaining a break out of poverty. The next slide illustrates the increase in productive assets. That's a 67% reduction in the gap. And the final slide there adds to it the 51% reduction in the land ownership gap. The next slide just summarizes some of these key results, coming back to the key points that Sadna identified earlier, demonstrating, I think, very convincingly, this is just one study. In the earlier study I cited the monitoring exercise, a second study, but there are several others that corroborate these findings. And the Ford CGAP pilots are interesting in 2 ways. One, when this model was adapted in 10 independent pilots and countless more in less strict applications of the model, like the South African adaptation was a very different kind of model. But in all of these cases, these programs were not as successful as the Bangladesh model, but they were far more successful than any other comparable program in the country. So it illustrates that BRAC's model really works well for Bangladesh, but it also has very important lessons for other countries around the world. Now, the next slide brings me to my second question. Why has this been successful? And there are lots of reasons. I want to focus on 2 of them. One, this issue of complexity that Sadna identified. What BRAC has done, perhaps better than any other program we've seen around the world, is that it has tackled a complex problem. Social protection takes a life cycle approach. Social protection for children is relatively simple. Social protection for older people is relatively simple. And social protection for people with disabilities, a bit more complicated, but still fairly simple. Where social protection systems around the developing world face the greatest challenges is providing developmental social protection for working age people. And BRAC has tackled that complexity with a multi-sectoral approach that provides a comprehensive intervention. Yes, a complex and more expensive than conventional social protection programs, but one that builds bridges across sectors, that strengthens developmental synergies and adds real value for money. And this is one of the lessons we've seen. Social protection on its own around the world actually generates very little in the way of developmental impact. It's when social protection interacts with social services, with financial inclusion, with livelihoods programs, with programs that build psychosocial resources, that these programs then generate the kinds of developmental impacts, perhaps nowhere nearly as successful as this program, as the evidence attests. But the second reason I think it's been so successful reflects some of the key themes that Sadna identified. I often describe this program, along with two of my other favorite programs, South Africa's Child Support Grant and Mexico's Prospera program, previously Oportunidades, and before that, Progressa. If a program has been renamed 3 times, you know it's on to something. But these 3 programs, including BRAC's Ultra Poor program, are 3 of the world's greatest failures. And I think that's a key to why they have worked. When you have a program that in its first couple of years fails, then you have a program that probably has tackled one of the country's most serious challenges. Mexico's Prospera program, Oportunidades, back when it was Progressa, in the first 6 months, they simply could not deliver the cash transfers. The program failed. South Africa's Child Support Grant was the same. In the first year, less than 1 out of 20 of the poorest children were getting the benefit. And likewise, given the complexity of BRAC's program, in the first couple of years, and this goes back decades, its antecedent program, it was not a success. But how many times have you heard a person describe a proposed intervention and the critique is, oh, that's way too complicated. Oh, that will never work. This is too risky. What BRAC had the courage to do was to tackle a nearly impossible program. And yes, initially to fail, but to look at the evidence and to figure out how to learn by doing and improve the program and turn it into one of the most successful social protection, and if not the most successful program in the world today. And that's a critical lesson. It's the 21st century. All the easy things have been done. If we're really going to be successful today in tackling the greatest problems that we face, we're going to have to take bigger risks. And that's going to risk failure. And that's okay if we have mechanisms for channeling the lessons of this experience into ongoing program improvement. And the first slide I showed, showing that trajectory over the cohorts, demonstrates that that's what BRAC has been able to do. My final slide just concludes with a few key implications for social protection. What we see when we look at social protection's life cycle approach around the world is it mainly focuses on provision. We look at programs primarily for the world's most vulnerable groups: children, older people, people with disabilities. But one of the challenges with this provision approach is it sometimes has limited developmental impact. If households have to exit this program, they often graduate right back into poverty. Whereas BRAC's approach, targeting a different stage of the life cycle, a different vulnerable group, is able to enable and empower the poorest and most vulnerable households and strengthen their resilience. And in doing so, to meet broader social protection objectives. And it goes one step further, because policymakers are demanding this developmental impact by linking social protection to a graduation approach that strengthens inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. Is winning friends with finance ministers, with planning commissions, with the kinds of policymakers that expand the political constituency for social protection and enables a more vibrant and more supportive environment for the entire life cycle approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that excellent presentation as well. Questions are coming through thick and fast for yourself and also for Sadhna. And we're going to move into the question time now. So keep them coming through via the chat section. But I had a few to start with that partly to do my own questions, but also a few that have come through. On that last message that you had, Michael, around monitoring, this idea of improving over time, of amending and adapting the program both from the community mapping and the ranking and the investment level through to what happens when someone doesn't thrive under the ultra-poor program. 95% graduate in one of the slides that we showed. And what happens to the other 5% and where do they go? I also had a question around management, possibly for Sadhna. You've spoken at length, as have you, Michael, about BRAC's hands-on approach, and I saw this in the field. It's incredibly time-heavy and it requires a lot of investment in terms of facilitators working weekly meetings. I saw both in groups but also individual meetings as well for each person who was involved in this program. But also, and it would be useful to hear from you, Sadhna, about how that management model can be translated more, and you touched on that in your presentation, but having a further description of that would be good as well. And Michael, anything you can add would be helpful. And finally, for this round of questions, and we'll have a couple more rounds of questions, I wanted to talk about what was referred to in your presentation, Sadhna, and both presentations actually, about how the Targeting Ultra-Poor program in Bangladesh for BRAC interlinks with a vast series of other programs that BRAC have, where there's reference back and forth. So within the Ultra-Poor program, people were able to access assets from the microfinance program. They'd be referred to education services in BRAC and to health services in BRAC. And how that referred support assists the Ultra-Poor program, and maybe some comments on if the Ultra-Poor program itself can be viewed in isolation of those other interventions that BRAC had. So over to you, maybe Michael, starting as you just said, and then Sadhna to respond.
Sure. Yeah, let me start with that first question you asked. Yes, the latest data that Sadhna identified, the 95% plus graduation, implies that there are 4%, maybe 5% who do not significantly improve their well-being with the program. and the randomized control trial provides some illumination into what's happening here. The thing about a graduation program is it requires a heavy investment by the participating household. So there can be really big winners, and we've seen evidence of households becoming very prosperous over time through the program, but there can also be losers, something that we don't see with a typical social protection program. If you're just providing a benefit, you're not requiring a lot of investment on the part of the household in the program, but BRAC's program does. And so if the asset fails, or if the household turns out not to be well suited for the intervention, it can actually end up worse off. I think BRAC has put in place a number of mechanisms, and I'll leave it to Sadna to address how they deal with this. I do understand that increasingly they provide insurance for the asset owner. So if the cow dies, the cow can be insured, and that can reduce some of the potential losses to the household. And there are other programs that BRAC puts in place to help mitigate the losses. But this is a complex program. It's not a handout, and so it is going to require a fair amount of investment and effort on the part of the participating household. So if that livelihood does not work out, they can end up worse off than in the absence of the program. But that's a very small percentage of the cases. Sadna, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. There's also some data that we've compiled internally that seems to suggest that of the 4 to 5% of people who don't meet all those graduation criteria at the end of 2 years, that some portion of them do end up meeting those criteria further on. So let's say a year later. So they might be a little bit slower on the progression, but eventually they get to a point where their growth and progress can actually meet that multiple set of graduation criteria that we talked about. Now, as far as within the programming, there are certain mechanisms that we use to identify what we would call sort of slow climbers. So as we have developed some level of muscle memory and sort of experience around programming, our frontline staff are fairly acutely aware of sort of where households should be in terms of meeting that internal monitoring criteria, let's say at the 12-month mark or the 16-month mark or the 18-month mark. And by the 16th and 18th month or so, a frontline worker essentially knows, because they're going into the household on a weekly or a bi-monthly basis, that this household is dragging a little bit further behind in terms of reaching food security outcomes, in terms of diversifying their assets, in terms of having a multiplicity of income coming to the household. And then the directive for that program officer or frontline worker is to double down a bit on that household, to spend a little bit of extra time in the guidance and the coaching and the mentoring. So there's that level of sort of second round support, if you will. And there's also a provision, of course, in the case that there is sort of a shock that happens either geographically in that area that might impact livestock or assets, or in the case that there's a death in the family or a significant health event, or in the case that assets that are transferred, particularly livestock, expire, we do have a provision for replacing that and ensuring that the investment that we've made in the household is not lost because of a shock event. So on to the question then about sort of management structures that Sally asked about. Yes, it is a what we call a high-touch approach, and a lot of the innovation around I think the next round of adaptation and pilots around graduation is really to try to test and unpack that. So all of the RCTs really seem to confirm that this combination of things working together delivers outcomes, but the RCTs have not gone into the depth and detail of understanding which of these pieces can be pulled back, sort of disaggregated, recombined. And so that might be the next round of research that we see in this area. But we do see different models around staffing, so and things that are happening already. So already in our program, in our next phase of delivery, what we're looking to do, based on some internal research that seems to support support this is that weekly visit, we're now going to pull back a little bit to see if we can do that on a bi-monthly basis and actually lift some of the training that happens usually on an interpersonal basis into a group format. So there are different variations, and we see that some of the governments and the other NGOs that are working with, that are trying to pilot the approach, are similarly looking at ways to sort of reduce a little bit of the sort of frontline staff burden and create platform effects around how to deliver some of this messaging and content. And we also see different permutations of how you can bring staff into the management fold. So, for instance, we're working with CARE in Kenya as part of a government-sanctioned graduation pilot, and rather than, and CARE's model in Kenya is that rather than hire a lot of sort of frontline staff for the various projects that they manage, they instead identify what are called community-based trainers or community-based volunteers, which are stipended. So they're not considered sort of CARE staff per se. They're sort of paid at a slightly lower scale, and that sort of will help defray the cost. But we don't yet have the data to know definitively whether these individuals can deliver the same kind of intervention and what those trade-offs will be. Similarly, we've seen other graduation programs where governments will tap extension workers, will provide stipends to them. These are sort of social workers and extension workers that exist in communities that address agricultural issues or livestock-related issues on behalf of the government, and they're upskilled a little bit and provided a stipend in order to be able to be that frontline extension of staff. So we see different models of this, but we coming together, but we suspect that there's always going to need to be some level of individual engagement and coaching between the frontline staff person and the participant, because ultimately there's a level of trust and confidence building and guidance and coaching that likely can't happen in a group context, that likely needs some level of investment, that likely is a key part of the outcomes that we're seeing. And should I also, Sally, address the question of interlinkage with other programs?
Yes, if you can, that would be great.
Yeah. So that's an interesting question that you asked about, can the Targeting the Ultra-Poor program exist alone in and of itself and not interlinked with other programs? I would say no, and I don't think that it would have come to the sort of level of success that it has without reliance on BRAC scaled-up programming in other areas. I would even go a step further and to say that our work in graduation in terms of promoting livelihoods and putting destitute households on a path of economic progress and sustainable economic development follows decades of market-making supply-side interventions that have been crowded into these areas around developing markets, around making sure that there's a value chain around agriculture support, making sure that there's a value chain around supporting livestock, artificial insemination. So a lot of the work that BRAC has done over the past decades have made possible a recombination of some of these interventions to address the poorest. But we also happily see that the approach can be applied in different ways and isn't beholden to the need to have a scaled-up health system right alongside, or a scaled-up microfinance operation. And we see the approach being applied now very rapidly in different country contexts. So back to the Kenya example that I was just talking about, there isn't necessarily a health component that integrates seamlessly with the pilot work in Kenya, but we're looking to instead ensure that participants have their costs covered in a national health insurance fund, to make sure that there are linkages and that there's messaging around what households need to do in the case of a significant health event, and that some basic costs of availing of those services are covered in the approach. So we're now getting to a point where we're really testing and stretching how to recombine the things that exist in communities as far as financial inclusion, as far as health and other areas, to really see how we can nest the approach better in different country contexts within social protection agencies and INGOs.
Thank you. Michael, did you have anything to add to that?
No, that was very clear.
Yeah, thank you. That was very clear and extremely interesting. I had a couple of other questions that are coming through that are related to what you were just saying, Sadhna, and also, Michael, what you were just presenting as well. Firstly, around the minimum capacity that might be required in a community to even enter a program like this, and whether there was any evidence that there was sort of a slow start and then a surge in people's ability to engage with the program and thrive under the program, as capacity was built around everything from financial literacy through to health and education, what have you, in the targeting ultra-poor model. Secondly, there were some questions coming through about externalities and the impact that the BRAC model has, that ultra-poor social protection through graduation models have on the community surrounding that aren't engaged in the program, and whether there was evidence of any impact at all, be it positive or negative, around this. And I'd just like to pick up something you said, Michael, in your presentation around governments and I guess donors engaging with the model, and linking that back to the conversation we were just having around the, I think you used the phrase high-touch program and some of the work BRAC's doing to adapt that model, and whether the information was passed on to those donors, I guess, or how much the information was shared around the cost of the program. And Sadhna, you mentioned in your presentation that it's actually a relatively low-cost program when you look at it in comparison to other activities attempting to target the same group and achieve the same goals. But I do also know, from DFAT, the pressure that implementers are under from their donor bodies to keep costs low, and what those interpretation might be of facilitators being a cost for a program versus core to that implementation. Thank you. So over to whoever would like to start.
Michael, do you want to start with that last question?
Sure. I can say a few words about externalities and then talk a little bit about value for money. The 7-year study did identify very important positive externalities for other people in the communities. What BRAC is doing is helping to revitalize entire communities. And so it's producing economic benefits not only for the participants, but economic multipliers in the communities in which these participants are benefiting. And this is something that we see in a lot of countries that are implementing social protection programs. The social protection programs create a demand-side stimulus to local economic activity. And so if all we do is study the beneficiaries, we undervalue the program. And that helps answer Sally Ann's question about, well, is this an expensive program, and is this generating value for money? This is an important question. When I compare BRAC's program to similar programs in Bangladesh, it is more cost effective than most of the other programs that we compare this program to, and it is also highly effective. When we look at the value for money in other countries, however, where the model's being applied, it's more expensive. It is somewhat, the graduation rates are somewhat lower, and so the value for money is somewhat less. Now part of this, I think, is attributable to BRAC's management and the way the organization operates. If you work with BRAC, you understand what kind of organization you're working with. It's an organization that works better than any NGO that I know, and it has a strong confidence in its ability to learn and develop working models. Development partners will provide funding support for BRAC and often have their own review processes that say, okay, based on the midterm review, we want you to consider these changes. whereas another NGO might say, okay, well, this is where the money's coming from, let's make these changes. BRAC will look at its experience in identifying over the long term what works and make its own decisions about how to implement its program, much more autonomously than any NGO I know. And development partners respect that and understand BRAC knows what it's doing. When we look at the model as applied in other countries, we do not see such strong NGOs for the most part. And I think that's one of the reasons it's a little bit more difficult to adapt globally. But in terms of value for money, when we see a program where the developmental impacts are actually increasing over time, we need to take a much longer horizon in valuing the rates of return. So we can't just look at cost. We really have to look at value for money. And that value for money analysis has to be more dynamic and more forward-looking than the typical assessment frameworks development partners have in place. The second important point is, if we want to make this program even more cost-effective, if we want to identify the right combination of inputs, can we reduce the expensive coaching input? Certainly in other countries where this coaching input is relatively more expensive. We need an evaluation approach that can better channel learning by doing into ongoing program improvement. And our typical evaluation approaches cannot do that. And RCT cannot do that. But BRAC has, and I think this is one of the less studied features of BRAC's success, BRAC has developed implicitly a learning by doing model for channeling evidence into ongoing program improvement. And if we can learn more about how BRAC has done that, we can probably improve the value for money of these programs.
Thanks for that, Michael. So I think you addressed the externalities question very clearly. I just wanted to speak very briefly to Sally's question, which ties a little bit into your comments about sort of, how did this start, and how was the learning around implementation, and was it as successful in the beginning? And going back to Michael's comments, really we can't really, I think about the start of the program as being 2002. It goes back about a decade earlier than that to its predecessor program, IGVGD, and many lessons learned there in terms of, how do you sort of align all of these resources and interventions into a household in a way that's not overwhelming? How do you expect this kind of service and intervention from your frontline staff? Thinking through what the right sort of combination of group versus individual interventions were, creating sort of staff training that was consumable, digestible, creating messaging for households in a way that incorporates repetition, that incorporates visuals. There was a lot to learn and figure out in this sort of combination and sequencing of events that allowed us to, in 2002, really start to formalize the program. And even since then, there's been a tremendous amount of change and innovation and testing, and there have been, we're now about to start the 4th phase of programming since 2002, and phase 4 will be quite different in many, many ways, partly addressing the changing poverty landscape and dynamics of the Bangladesh context. For instance, we had to really think through whether the consumption stipend piece of the intervention that we're doing really applies anymore, because that level of sort of destitution that we saw in the late 90s, the early 2000s, where you absolutely need a tiny bit of a trickle-in of a consumption stipend to get people to focus on this asset and to sort of increase caloric intake in the household is potentially not as relevant anymore in the rural Bangladeshi context as it was a decade and a half ago. So there's a lot of learning and innovation that's still going on. And I think it's important to underscore that in Michael's graphic where you saw sort of an increase in progression and sort of performance outcomes over two panels of cohorts, that some of that is about like management, learning, and innovation, but some of that is also about better messaging in the community and participants understanding more and better what's expected of them after having seen success happens not just for our staff but for participants and recipients of this intervention as well. And so I think all of that really factors into an underscoring and a message that we always reinforce with our advisory work and the work that we do with other clients, which is that this is not an off-the-shelf approach. It is necessarily one that has to be tailored and adapted to a local country context, to an organizational context. It has to fit in with the fabric of your organizational infrastructure. And in doing that, there are some cost considerations. As Michael pointed out, I think there needs to be more focus on value for money considerations as opposed to straightforward costs. You know, what outcomes are we seeking along which timeline, and is this the better use of resources or a use of resources that attains a different set of outcomes that's desirable for donors? But at face value, and that's why one of my slides is really about sort of the cost calculations and conversations not being as straightforward as they appear to be. At face value, this approach does seem to go to sort of fly in the face somewhat of the prevailing development sector directive and norm, which is to reduce management costs to the extent absolutely possible to sort of drive down overhead costs. And so is often a difficult conversation when we talk through the budgeting and working with social protection agencies who are constrained by a directive to, let's say, you know, keep their staffing costs at below 5%, 7%, 8%. So how does this fit in with that? And I really think that the next evolution of graduation programming, and if we're really to make a dent with integrating it meaningfully with social protection strategies, really requires a broad rethink on the part of multilaterals and governments about the value for money question and how some of these resources are aligned. And I do think that the evidence seems to suggest that we're heading in that direction.
Thank you. So we've got about 20 minutes left, and we have a couple of questions coming through in very much in direct response to what you've both just been saying around the adaptability of the program and the changes that you were both talking about, the interventions that you were both talking about require a pretty robust monitoring regime, and there are a lot of questions about how the monitoring happens. Essentially, what is the monitoring system like for the ultra-poor graduation approach? And secondly, we've got a few questions coming through around adapting the program in other contexts, and particularly around coordination, where there are multi-sector approaches engaged with multi-partners. So a social protection program that works on a graduation model is also working with INGOs, NGOs and government, who are providing some of those other safety net services that in Bangladesh BRAC is able to apply. And if there was any evidence or advice on how to improve those coordination services or how to address those within a program in another context. So those two around monitoring and coordination.
Michael, let me know if you'd like to chime in on all of these questions. I can
you go ahead. Why don't you start? Okay.
Sure. So on monitoring, as prolifically scaled as this program has been for a decade and a half, largely our monitoring has actually relied on paper-based systems, which is a reality that we're working quickly to change. As of 2014 and 2015, in partnership with a technology product called Impact Atlas. So whereas before a lot of this was paper-based, now we're looking to create monitoring systems that actually put a smart device in the hands of the program officers and the frontline staff, whereby they are essentially entering data about the participant during the process of their home visit, which does two things. It helps check in on the progress of the frontline staff worker. It allows upper level management to check in and ensure that this person is visiting the household at the right frequency, that they're sort of disseminating the right content and messaging, but it also helps to provide a much more real-time snapshot of where households are in their progression out of poverty. So we should, once this is sort of instituted and scaled up in certain areas, we should be able to have a dashboard view that allows us to see, okay, in X region of Bangladesh, these two asset packages are disproportionately sort of failing, or disproportionately they seem to be incredibly successful asset packages, or to be able to geographically isolate and have real-time indicators of when things are going wrong, where there might be an event that affects livestock. So we're looking at implementing a technology MIS that really helps us both on the progress and process monitoring aspects of the work, as well as in tracking household level outcomes. And we're in the process of piloting that in different regions of Bangladesh, and also are encouraging the clients that we work with globally to take a look at the various products that are out there in terms of technology MIS around the approach. And Sally, your second question was...
Sorry, Sadna, I'm just going to interrupt. And could you also discuss the importance of, whether there's an importance in having a common system between the different interventions that are looking, a common monitoring and evaluation system, I should say, when we're looking at the interventions around targeting the ultra-poor?
Right. So I think this question is, I think it's largely a question of the specific organization that you're working with. So for instance, when we advise government social protection agencies, it is necessary to work within the context of the monitoring and evaluation frameworks that they already employ. So then the question there is, how can we onboard and activities and graduation desired program monitoring outcomes. So in terms of a common approach, I think that would be fantastic, and that's in part there are organizations that are working towards developing information technology systems that would be, in an ideal circumstance, the kind of off-the-shelf technology product that various graduation programs would implement to then be able to sort of cycle data up so that we can see graduation outcomes globally. But in real terms, we also see that that this can be a real sticky point and another layer of complexity that implementing partners will need to contend with. And in practical terms, in our advisory work, certainly we have to take a look at what exists in terms of monitoring and how to strengthen that, as opposed to looking at wholly new systems to implement. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. I think it does answer the question. Michael, just on monitoring, and before we move on to the issue of coordination, given the work that you've been doing is essentially taking the data, the monitoring data, and assessing those and analysing those, how important is that data collection, and how important is it that it's coordinated and common across multiple interventions addressing this issue?
This is a really important question, and I think the point Sadna just made is really illuminating. BRAC has done all of this without an electronic MIS. And so you might ask yourself, what could BRAC have done if they had an electronic MIS? Maybe not so much, because what BRAC has done, there's a risk with an electronic MIS that it can lead to a reductionist leading by numbers. And we rarely see countries use social protection single registries effectively. We've been working in a number of countries. Only Brazil really uses their MIS to their full potential, integrating programs, planning policy interventions. And what BRAC has done has been to develop a monitoring process that is much more implicit. Yes, they're taking the numbers at local level, aggregating them on paper reports, consolidating them in DACA so that you see the overall program. But in DACA right now with the current MIS, you cannot see the interactions among households. You cannot see individual household level data. That's the innovation that's currently in progress. So, which is why when we did the exercise, we had to work in DACA and we had to go out into the field to really understand what these aggregated numbers meant. But what we could also see was that the management structure was able to tap local knowledge and aggregate it and infer from that evidence better ways to do things that did not require a quantitative MIS. And I think it's important not to lose the value that that process has added. And there's a tendency, once you have a centralized electronic MIS, to trust those numbers more than the knowledge-generating processes that have made this program so successful. And so I think that's the first caution I want to highlight. The second is that an electronic MIS can add enormous value if you're really using it to its potential. And I don't have time to go into all the stories in countries where countries have said, but why would we do that? I mean, we're using this for targeting. We're not using it for integrating. We're not using it for planning. We're not using it for all these things that can add value. But if you're going to make that investment in a single registry, you have to go beyond using it as an administrative data system, as a targeting mechanism. It's really important to use it to link households to the programs from which they can benefit the most. It's really important to use the system in order to plan the appropriate interventions to deliver at local level. And third, it's really important to use the MIS to be able to evaluate the combinations of interventions that deliver the greatest value for money. All three of these are really big challenges. I probably have to take a half hour to unpack them, but I just want to highlight that those are the three really big value-adding elements of an electronic MIS, and most countries do not take advantage of them.
Thank you. And that does lead quite neatly into the second question that I interrupted you for to expand on monitoring and evaluation, which was around coordination and what the evidence is or what the suggestions are for improving coordination in areas where there are multi-stakeholders and multi-partners operating these programs.
So in terms of evidence base around that, the short answer is that we don't have a tremendous amount of evidence around coordination functions. The body of the RCT7 so far and other research designs behind graduation approaches have thus far largely been about sort of understanding whether this combination of interventions works. So the question of does it work as opposed to necessarily how it works and how it can better work. And so those are the next round of questions that need to be unpacked in sort of graduation 2.0 or 3.0 depending on wherever we may be. But in terms of the sort of practical application of the coordination questions, some different examples of how we see this playing out. So there's, as Michael pointed out, it's rare to have an NGO that's going to be able to sort of deliver this in-house and interlink it with other programs in health and financial inclusion and the like. So you're already seeing NGOs and microfinance institutions actually implement the approach and already build local level partnerships with organizations that provide core competencies that are not in their mix. For instance, Focose, a microfinance institution in Haiti, which does tremendous work in graduation programming, has a really strong partnership with Partners in Health that provides, that supplies all of the sort of health components of the approach, because microfinance institutions typically don't venture into that area of programming. So that's with NGO implementation. Now, in terms of government organizations that are implementing, or government social protection agencies that are implementing graduation approaches, it seems that the natural point of entry, sort of the lowest common denominator point of entry for graduation programs, seems to be with cash transfers. So with cash transfer programs that are sort of thought of to be the consumption stipend piece of a graduation approach. And then thinking about, well, how do you layer and onboard these other interventions? How do you assure that there's a higher value kick into the household through an asset transfer or through a loan? So sometimes that's in partnership with other financial inclusion organizations. So we see some examples of that, where local organizations implementing graduation programs are trying to strike and forge partnerships with microfinance institutions to provide capital for the asset transfer and injection. And we also see examples where some of this onboarding and layering work tries to pull in elements of cash for work programs or feeding programs, where you see programs that are about upskilling individuals on cash transfers a little further being augmented to instead look a little bit more like the asset transfer and technical training components of graduation in-house within the larger scaled up social protection programs. There are also examples where governments are looking to outsource the implementation of a lot of this work to larger and smaller NGOs. So we work in other countries where our primary client is a government, but the actual implementers are NGOs and other organizations. And I think that the real sort of area of exploration that we haven't really seen a terrible amount of momentum yet, but are actually confident that that's the direction that we're heading, is around interministerial coordination to deliver some of these activities. So that requires a considerable amount of coordination and buy-in. This is a sequenced set of interventions, right? So it's not that these interventions can be supplied by different line ministries or different organizations parallelly without coordination. Coordination is absolutely key. And so the most, I think, complex version of this is potentially going to be the one that we need to invest quite a bit of time in studying through evaluation, but also in building buy-in around the need for ministries of finance and livelihoods and agriculture and health to work together to align the best of their programming to a subsegment of the population that could actually greatly benefit from a coordinated and a combined approach.
Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I can just reinforce that the key to improving value for money and the key to generating greater impact, particularly using a national MIS, is interministerial coordination, because that can help deliver some of the key components at scale much more cost effectively. Now, BRAC is vertically and horizontally integrated. It understands that if any key element of this program fails, then the whole program fails. It's not like if you have 8 elements and you deliver 7 of them successfully, you have an 85% successful program. You need to deliver every element 100% successfully to get this kind of impact. So as we move from that kind of heavily integrated, internally integrated system to something that might apply in other countries or at national scale, ensuring that quality and effectiveness is a critical role for a monitoring process. Because if we cannot get that to work, we cannot make these programs this effective. But we do not want to underestimate how difficult it is to get ministries to work together in this way. Again, I can spend a lot of time talking about stories. I just want to highlight that key theme that we have seen in country after country.
Thank you. Yes, I think any development practitioner who's been working on any kind of program would absolutely agree with you on the difficulty of coordination, particularly with multi-agencies and government agencies. We have about 6 minutes left, so don't go away, but I'm just going to give some concluding remarks and then ask Michael and Sadna to give just a final sum up from their point of view, if there's any piece of advice that they would like to pass on or a key challenge they'd like to pass on. That would be good. I'd just like to thank you both. It's been a really interesting discussion, and there are lots more questions coming through that we won't have a chance to get to right now. The social protection and employment community will organise more webinars on country experiences, particularly around linking social protection to sustainable employment. The next one will be in March 2017 on Chile, on the government of Chile's integrated approach to social protection and job creation. So keep an eye out for the notifications on the website for that. And you can also access materials on this topic and participate in other activities that are facilitated by the community by being a member of the community. So details about how to be a member are also on the website, and they'll be on the next slide. I think they're up in front here. So write that down and definitely join in. Thanks very much to BRAC, to the SPEC as well, the Social Protection Club, my colleagues in Jakarta, GIZ's Global Alliance for Social Protection, and finally for the Social Protection team in Brazil for making the webinar happen. Just one point, we had some comments coming through, Michael, around integrated information systems, and a couple of people wrote in saying that Cambodia and India have examples where there's a central MIS as well, managing multiple aspects, so maybe worth looking into. But finally, and the message will cut out in the next 4 minutes, but Sadna first, if I could just ask you what your key piece of, what your takeaway would be, or the piece you'd like people to take away from this seminar, and then Michael following on for you too as well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally-Ann, for a great job moderating, and to socialprotection.org and to Michael Sampson of EPRI. It's really been a pleasure to be with you here today. I think if there's a key takeaway and a piece for this audience in particular, given the social protection practitioners who participated with us, it's to engage with us to think through how it is that we might take what has been sort of researched and is proven about this model and integrate it into the work that you're currently doing and the questions that you're currently exploring. And as you saw, there's a great deal for us to learn and think through and adapt. Can that apply to your contexts and countries if you're working in climate change affected populations or among populations with conflict or other vulnerabilities? What are the right ways to think about borrowing elements of graduation in ways that might address the populations that you're interested in serving? And if there's a way that we can engage with you on that, we would be absolutely happy to do so. You can visit us at ultrapoorgraduation.com, and I think this webinar will also have contact information on how to get in touch with us. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Sally-Ann and Sadna, for these great inputs, and let me thank socialprotection.org and all of you who have been participating. I just want to highlight these two key reasons why I think BRAC has been so successful. One is this key idea we've just been discussing. BRAC has been able to build comprehensive and integrated approaches that link multiple interventions together to create really important synergies. And this is more important than just making a livelihoods program work. It's a broader lesson for all of us who work in social protection and more broadly in areas that impact on inclusive and equitable economic growth. that if we can get interventions to work better together, we can generate greater developmental impact, greater value for money. But the second point is that BRAC has been bold in tackling one of the most challenging problems facing Bangladesh and facing many of our countries. BRAC took a big risk. Nobody wants to fail. And it's that fear of failure that often encourages us to do the easier things, the less important things. The fact that BRAC was able to do this and was able to channel learning by doing into this remarkable process of improving programs is a key lesson we all need to learn more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Sadna. This will cut out shortly, so thank you again to socialprotection.org, and I hope you've all enjoyed the webinar. The Australian Government remains a very proud partner of BRAC, and I can guarantee you that if you're looking at activities on the ground here in Bangladesh, they're highly integrated and highly successful and very adaptable here, and I commend BRAC for their openness in discussing that adaptability, failure, and improvement, and some of those key lessons in their success. Thank you all.
Thank you.
The session is still going on, so I'm going to ask one more